Okay, now back to talking about community ecology and food chains. Now, there's a limit to the length of food chains. They don't just go on and on. And there's a couple thoughts about why this is. There's what's known as the energetic hypothesis and the dynamic stability hypothesis. The energetic hypothesis is based on basically the second law of thermodynamics and says that because of the inefficiency with which energy is transferred from one link in a food chain to the next, the amount of energy decreases as you move up systems, and so, or move up a food chain, such that there's less available. And when we look up a food chain, you tend to have a decrease in biomass and a decrease in numbers, such that there's lots of plants, lots of plant biomass, but there are fewer herbivores and fewer herbivore biomass, fewer carnivores and even fewer carnivore biomass, and then if you go to a second level carnivore, etc., etc. So if you think about it this way, a top level carnivore has to roam over a large area to get the nutrition they need. And so think about if you were a carnivore of wolves, you would have to, wolves are pretty sparsely populated and there's not a whole lot of them and they roam over a large area, so you yourself would have to roam over a really large area and the amount of energy you would get for the effort would be minimal, and so that tends to limit them. Now the dynamic stability hypothesis proposes that food chains that get too long tend to be less stable. I tend to side with the energetics one, and that is the second law that thermodynamics tends to limit. Then it seems to be the primary driver, again, because you've got, as you move up in the food chain, a lot of the energy gets wasted as basically heat lost through respiration, or the energy is not even consumed, or it's not even used, it just goes straight through you in your waste. And so there's a certain inefficiency. In fact, it's generally thought that only about 10% of the energy in one level makes to the next, and so there's very little available excuse me, when you get to the end of the food chain. All right, again, there are certain species that can have an inordinate impact on a community. They can be very dominant and have a significant role in the dynamics of that community. That is, they're particularly good at exploiting resources, perhaps, or avoiding predators. Some of these we call keystone species, and the wording comes from arches. Stone arches have a keystone, which is at the top, and the keystone holds the arch together. If you remove the keystone, the arch falls apart. And so when we talk about communities, it's thought that there are certain species that exert an inordinate impact, and removal of them has a significant impact on the dynamics and diversity of that community. And so, for example, Pacific Northwest, again, studying starfish, sea stars that live in the intertidal zone. When they're around, you tend to have high diversity communities. When you remove them, diversity decreases. We see the same thing with sea otters. Sea otters aren't quite at the top of the food chain, but they are high up on the food chain, and they eat, among other things, sea urchins, if you can imagine these spiny creatures. But they figured out how to eat them, and they like eating them. And so when sea otters are around, they eat a lot of them. The sea urchins eat the kelp, and so when there's fewer sea urchins, there's more kelp. However, when there are fewer sea otters, that means there's going to be more sea urchins and less kelp. Well, why is that a problem? Well, because there's a lot of things that depend on the kelp, and so when the kelp numbers decrease, that has a big impact on the other things. And so here's the food web with the sea otters, nice sizable population. Again, you can see this nice thick arrow here. They eat lots of sea urchins, keeps the kelp numbers up, and that supplies food to lots of other things. However, I don't have the other picture. I thought I had a different picture. There's another one that shows when the sea otters are removed and you have less kelp around, that has a big impact, and a lot of these other species don't do so well, and some of them drop out of the system. So a sea otter would be considered a keystone species. There are some also that are engineers, like beavers, of course, that build dams, so they manipulate their environment. Termites build these large termite mounds in Africa that can impact local systems. All right. Some species have a big role in, we'll talk about ecological succession here in a minute, of sort of helping or facilitating other species. They sort of set the stage for other species to come in. All right, now, what controls the numbers of types of species? Well, of course, predators can control how many prey there are, and also food supply can control how many herbivores there are. And so these come into what are called bottom-up and top-down controls. So bottom-up control is when you are being limited by your food supply, what's below you in the food chain. Top-down controls is when you're being limited by the predators, the things trying to eat you. And so deer, for example, are kind of in the middle. And if there's not a whole lot of food, then they will starve and die, and so that means they're being controlled by the food supply. But if there's lots of wolves, it could be the wolves that are controlling them. Now, of course, it can be a combination of the two, bottom up and top down, but at any one time it can be more of one than the other as the system changes through time. Bottom up and top down controls. Disturbance of communities can impact the community. Obviously, if you go in and clear cut a forest, you have significantly decreased the diversity of that system. But disturbance to a certain extent can actually be okay. For example, there are certain communities that have developed, have evolved over time, being used to certain disturbances. You know, grasslands will burn occasionally, and that can have an impact on actually promoting diversity, promoting fertility. And rangelands, people who manage grasslands, rangelands, know about this and will occasionally burn these areas because it does increase the fertility that plant matter burns and adds nutrients to the soil, and then the plants that come back after that are much more robust, more for the herbivores to eat. There are certain species of trees that are used to having fire, particularly pine trees. Some have what are called serotinous cones that will only open if they're heated up, and then those seeds fall on that bare landscape and come up and grow quite nicely. And there's an idea that again, a certain amount of disturbance actually leads to greater diversity than if you have no disturbance and then relatively few species come to dominate the landscape. And disturbance can create a patchwork of habitats of different stages, some that are been disturbed most recently and have some of the early stage species, and some that are much older. And over a large landscape, that can create quite a variety of types. And so in the 80s, there was a big forest fire in Yellowstone, and the Forest Service, the National Park Service, just said, okay, we're just going to let it burn. And people were upset about that, but of course, in the meantime, afterwards, it's created some unique environments, and you've got lots of different species coming in there, and the landscape slowly changing over time. Of course, humans, we cause some of these disturbances as well, of varying kinds. When you convert a field to a parking lot, that's obviously a significant disturbance, but also something like agriculture is a disturbance as well. And so when the landscape becomes disturbed, becomes modified, it can set the stage for what we call ecological succession. And that is, now you know about a royal succession, and that's when the prince follows the king, etc., etc. Well, here what we have is one species sort of following another. And so if a landscape burns, what comes in first? Well, not really the trees so much, but the herbaceous, the smaller plants, the annuals, the herbaceous perennials that come in first. And then later the woody plants come in, etc., etc., and then it basically then over many decades develops back into a forest. But it will start out as a grassland basically, and then shrubs will come in, and then trees, etc. And so this is a common theme, rather self-evident, I think, but we can speak of two different types. It's called primary and secondary. And in primary succession, that's where the landscape is really denuded. It's just basically there's no soil. And this, say, after a volcanic eruption or after a glacier retreat, you basically have just rock and rubble behind. Now, in secondary succession, that's where you still have soil intact, but there's been, say, a forest fire, or maybe a bit of a mudslide or something like that, or a flood that may wash away some of the vegetation. You still have the soil intact. And so what happens is these early arriving species have to be quite hardy, particularly in primary succession, because they can only live off of rocks and there's very little soil there. They will often facilitate, they create the conditions for the later species to come in. That is, they begin to help build up soil that's going to allow other species to come in. Excuse me. So retreating glaciers have been a place where people have studied primary succession. So here's Glacier Bay up in Alaska. For many centuries now, the glacier has been retreating further and further up into the valleys, and so it leaves behind this relatively stark and bare landscape. Well, what happens is, of course, again, your smaller herbaceous plants come in first, then your smaller shrubs, and then finally your trees come in. And the earlier ones tend to, again, create conditions that allow the other ones to come in. They facilitate it, them coming in. Biogeography. So that term, biology, living things, geography, and so it's basically the distribution of living things, where they're found. And so location on the globe, location within continents, and the size of habitats are going to have a big impact on the types and numbers of living things that you find. There's a general trend that as you go from the equator up towards the pole, you tend to see decreases in diversity. Species richness decreases. It's thought that the sort of year-round tropical habitats of the tropics sort of fosters the development of a lot more diversity, whereas the temperate area like we live that has winters, or the Arctic areas further north that are cold for much of the year, don't allow for the evolutionary process to move along quite as quickly. And of course, those more northern areas that were affected by glaciers are a lot younger habitats. You go to a place like Michigan or Minnesota, and that 15,000 years ago, that thing was covered with ice. Those glaciers retreated and left a relatively bare landscape, and so they're essentially still developing, you might say. Climate plays a big role as well. The amount of energy and water available, and so again, there's lots of water in many tropical areas, not all, and lots of sunlight energy available that can increase that production of those plants. And so when you've got lots of water and lots of heat input, you'll get a lot of evapotranspiration from the plants, and so we tend to see greater, where in areas where you have more evapotranspiration, more water available, more energy available, you tend to see greater diversity in case of both plants and animals. So there's that pretty clear relationship there, particularly with the animals. And area, the size of an area can impact how many species you have, which probably isn't too surprising. If you have a bigger landscape, you'll tend to have more species than if you have a small landscape. And this was studied extensively by these two guys, E.O. Wilson and MacArthur. I can't think of his first name right now. Robert MacArthur and E.O. Wilson. They came up with the idea of what's called island biogeography, and it's a fairly, I think, to you, probably self-evident idea, but again, at the time it wasn't so much, and they studied it extensively and basically demonstrated that this is correct, and that is islands of different sizes have different number of species, and bigger islands tend to have more species, and islands that are closer to a mainland tend to have more species than islands that are more distant. And so there will basically be an equilibrium number of species that inhabit an island, and the number that it has is a function of the immigration, the influx of new species, and the extinction of species that have come there but not survived. And again, larger islands will tend to have more immigrants because they're a bigger target compared to small islands, and larger islands will tend to have lower extinction rates because they're more space and more resources, and so the combination of large size gives you more species than small size. And again, the same if you're a nearer island to a mainland, you'll tend to have more species just because you're closer, and so you'll have more species there. So island biogeography, and this has been studied extensively in different island chains around the world and has generally been demonstrated to be correct. And I am again running out of time on this video. We'll finish it up in the next one.